to sort of talk you through the basics of capturing a star spin, or even if it's just astrophotography. So I'll show you how I set up my camera, as well as the extra gear that I use to protect it from the cold. I've got my Nikon D600 full frame camera with a Tamron 24 to 70 mm telephoto lens, f2.8. I suppose I should explain why I use a dew heater. What happens is that glass can tend to get colder than the ambient temperature, and when it gets colder than the ambient temperature, it attracts the dew in the air, and then you have condensation or fog forming on the lens. When I started off doing time lapses, and when I started off doing star spins, as some people call it, at night, there was my first 2 attempts fogged up within half an hour, so it's like I only ended up with about 2 seconds or 3 seconds worth of usable footage before the lens fogged over. And then I did a little bit of research on the internet and so on, and I came across dew heaters, which are mainly used for telescopes for the same purpose. They're basically bands full of resistors that's wrapped around the lens, or wrapped around a tube of the telescope, and then it connected to a controller, and then to a 12-volt power supply, and then those resistors actually heat up and produce heat. So it heats up the telescope tube so that it's warm, so that the glass becomes warmer than the ambient temperature. So it doesn't matter how cold it gets, the glass is still warmer, so no dew or condensation will form. And so it's the same principle for the camera lens. I wrap this dew heater band around the camera lens. It keeps the lens warm, keeps the glass in the lens warmer than the ambient temperature, and it prevents it from fogging over. Which, you know, if you're trying to do a 4 or 5 hour capture sequence, and sometimes it can drop to 2 degrees overnight, the last thing you want is have this, this really good setup of the sky, the Milky Way, and then it fogs over. So you've wasted 4 hours. So I've got my 12-volt battery, which I use to supply the unit. It's probably a little bit of overkill, but with the particular controller I use, I actually connect 2 cameras up at once. So this battery actually runs 2 dew heaters for 2 cameras. So that's my 12-volt power supply. This here is actually the band. So this part here, I believe, is full of resistors that heat up. And then at the other end, you've got like an RCA plug connection that plugs into the controller. So first up, I'll wrap the lens. So I wrap the dew heater around the lens. Now you can see that this dew heater is actually oversized, but it does it because it's for a larger telescope. You can get different lengths for different size telescopes. But in my case, I'm not too worried. As long as it's wrapped around, it'll still function, still warm up the lens. Then this here is it's called a dual controller. You can get single controllers, but this is a dual controller, so it's actually got 4 points here, which can actually connect to 4 separate telescopes with dew heaters, or 4 dew heaters. So that's why I tend to run it two cameras off the one controller. So plug into the controller for the dew heater. And one thing I can't stress enough is to make sure that these alligator clips go in the correct terminal of the battery. I remember I actually bought a single controller, dew heater controller once, and it was in the middle of the night, and I thought I had it on the right terminal, and ended up, well, it wasn't, and I ended up blowing up the controller. So make sure that red goes to red. Switch it on. So now I've got power. So like I said, this has got 2 controllers, but I'm only running it off one at the moment. So I turn the right one all the way to the left to turn it off. And this controller here, which will control, or this knob here, which will control the 2 left connections, I'll adjust that. You can either have it at maximum, which obviously the higher you have it, the less time your battery will last. So you want to try and conserve power, so I generally go halfway. So that's my dew heater band wrapped around the lens, connected to controller, which is then connected to the 12 volt power supply, and then I've adjusted the power knob on the controller itself to halfway in between maximum and minimum, just to give it an average amount of heat. Okay, now that I've got the dew heater wrapped around the lens and I've got it going to keep the lens warm, I'll go through the basic camera settings that I have switched on and switched off. One of the very first things that I do is I format the memory cards. Now the reason why I do this is the first thing that I do before I even think about composing the scene or adjusting any of the camera exposure settings, is because there's been a few times early on when I was doing time lapses that I was in such a hurry or such a rush to set everything up because there was a beautiful sunset happening, I didn't want to miss it, that I'd actually forgotten to format the card or check that I formatted the memory card in the camera. So I had everything going, then within half an hour the camera stopped because the card had filled up. So I missed out on a 2-hour sunset because I was in such a rush to not remember to check that the SD card was empty. So in the shooting menu, I make sure that ISO sensitivity is switched off. The main reason why I don't shoot with auto ISO is mainly because with time lapses you need to make sure that each frame is the same as the one before and after. So if you let the camera, say, control the white balance, or let the camera control the exposure settings like the shutter speed and so on, you'll end up with flickering from frame to frame when you compile the photo or the capture sequence together, and then when you play it back as a video you'll get this annoying flicker. So it's always best to make sure that you shoot everything manual. So that means you focus manually, you set your white balance manually, you set your shutter speed, aperture and ISO manually, and then that way you've eliminated the best you can any kind of variability from frame to frame. Okay, now we go to high ISO noise reduction, make sure that's off. Then I go to long exposure noise reduction, make sure that's off. Now with the in-camera noise reduction, your camera may have a different terminology depending on the brand, but you need, for time lapses, you need to make sure that you turn off noise reduction, especially for low light and night photography, because what the camera is doing when you have noise reduction switched on is that let's say you set your exposure for 30 seconds, so it'll capture the initial 30 seconds, and then while the shutter's down it'll capture a second dark frame for the same amount of time. And what that dark frame does is it captures any hot pixels or any image noise from the image sensor, because one thing you've got to keep in mind, that the higher ISO you go, like 1600 and upwards, you'll start getting a bit of image noise creeping in. And what that basically is, it's basically a thermal side effect of the sensor having to work harder and becoming more sensitive. So it's like an electrical side effect. You'll get a lot of image noise like red haze or dots throughout your shot. So what the dark frame does is it actually captures that reddish noise and then it subtracts it from the original exposure it took to clean up the image. Now with time lapses, or particularly night time lapses of the stars in the Milky Way, you can't really afford to have an interval of a minute, because you've got to remember, initial 30 seconds and then a dark frame for 30 seconds means it's about a minute at least, plus the amount of time it takes to record to your memory card between intervals. In regards to motion, it won't affect the motion too much, you'll just have less frames. You want the camera to capture a frame every 30 seconds, not every minute. And that way, not only do you get smoother playback, but it prolongs the life of the battery, so you get more frames as well, because you've got to think the camera's got to work harder, or the sensor's got to work harder, because it's got to take 2 photos per frame. So if noise reduction's switched off, you're only taking the one. This is a Nikon camera. I'm not sure about Canons, but with the Nikons you make sure you have active delighting switched off. And again, that's because you don't want the camera to have any kind of control with the exposure. Color space, the cameras normally come as default with sRGB. I set it up to Adobe RGB. The reason why I do that, is that with the Adobe RGB color space, it's actually got a wider color gamut, which means it's got a lot more tonal colors or mid-tonal colors and so on compared to the sRGB. By using the Adobe RGB, you're capturing more tonal information, particularly in the RAW file, that you can bring out later on in post-editing. Now in image quality, I always set it up so I'm taking, in the case of the Nikon, it's an NEF file, which is the camera's RAW format, as well as the JPEG. Now the reason why I capture the RAW format as well as JPEG is that I use the JPEGs as a quick way to compile first thing in the morning or as soon as I've uploaded it to my laptop to quickly see how the overall capture sequence went. So it gives me an idea if there was any issues and so on. And then the RAW files I use for my actual image editing. And the other setting that I switch off in the playback menu, make sure that image review is switched off. The main reason for that again is that I'm trying to prolong the life of the battery. So if during your capture session you're capturing about 400 frames, you really don't want this LCD display to come on 400 times because it's obviously using power to switch on and off. So by having that setting switched off, to prevent it from coming on, you're probably gaining an extra 50 to 100 extra frames because you're not using that extra power. The part that I sometimes find hard is the focusing issue. Like with this particular lens, so there's a gauge on there with an infinity symbol I line up and I know it's focused. And some of the basic kit lenses that come with the Nikons, like the 18 to 55mm BR lenses, you don't have any gauge. So often that can take, you roughly focus it by eye, which is quite difficult at night when it's low light. You take a photo, preview the screen, preview it on the LCD screens. So that can be time consuming where you're taking a shot out of focus, adjust the lens, take another shot, still out of focus, so you keep going until you get it right. That's actually how I started off initially, and sometimes it could take me bloody half an hour to actually get it focused. But a little trick I found is during the day I'll focus the camera, autofocus the camera on like a tree line in the horizon, and then I'll take a photo, I'll preview that photo on the LCD screen on the camera, zoom in, and then if it looks like it's nice and sharp, or that's as sharp as I can get it, I then mark the focus ring and the lens in a couple of points with a marker or a texter, and then I know that when I'm setting up at night I can just quickly line those marks up, take a shot, and if it looks like it's in perfect focus I'll go ahead. If not, I know I just got to adjust it a little bit. So that's just a little tip you can do. So what ISO settings do I generally use? Depending on if the moon's out or not. Generally I use like ISO 1600 and upwards, depending on the camera model. Like the D600 is a full frame camera, so it works pretty well in low noise. So I can go up as high as ISO 6400 for example, using the Tamron f2.8 lens, which is a fast lens, and I can get quite a lot of good detail, a lot of illumination of the Milky Way for example, with very little noise. But if I compare that to say the Nikon D5100 I've got, if I was to set that at the ISO 6400 I'll have a lot more image noise. So keep in mind that the higher ISO you got, depending on your camera's capability at those higher ISOs, there will be image noise introduced. But in general, with low light photography or astrophotography, I start off with a basis of ISO 1600, and then I use shutter speeds ranging from 20 seconds to 30 seconds. If I'm using an f2.8 lens, generally I can get away with 20 seconds, but with the standard kit lenses, which are f3.5, most of the time I'm using 30-second exposures. Okay, now once you've focused your scene, make sure you have autofocus switched off on the lens as well as on the camera body if you've got that facility, and also make sure your lens vibration control is switched off. And now we'll set up our exposure settings, so ISO, aperture at its widest, which is f2.8 on this lens, and exposure or shutter speed to 20 seconds. Take a photo, and then what I'll also do when the camera finishes exposure, I'll count how many seconds it takes to write to the SD card, because that's what I've got to take into account with the camera intervals. 1, 1000, 2, 1000, 3, 1000, 4, 1000, 5, 1000, 6, 1000. Okay, so roughly 6 seconds. So what that means is that provided that the exposure is correct, I'll be adding 6 seconds onto the exposure time. So if it's 20 seconds we settle on, it'll be 20 seconds plus 6 seconds to write to the card, which gives me your 26-second minimum interval. And usually I'll add an extra second on that as well, just to make sure that I've got plenty of time for the camera to record the image to the SD card without overrunning its buffer, which means when the camera's buffer is full, you'll start missing out on frames. Now that we're happy with the capture and the ISO settings are correct, we'll take note of the shutter speed, which again is 20 seconds plus 6 seconds to write to the card. So when we go to the camera's shooting menu, because the D600's got an internal intervalometer or time lapse function, so if you use an external remote, you need to punch in or use 26 seconds as the interval. So once this is all set up and going, that's when I'll walk away, and I'll let it go for about 4 or 5 hours, and sometimes I won't, depending on how tired I am, I won't actually get to it till the next morning, which is why I like picking locations where there's no one around and I know there's no chance of anyone coming along, walking into shot, bumping the camera or even stealing it. Okay, another little technique you can try to add more to your photos is light painting, and that's basically where, for example, in my case I use these solar powered spotlights, and I use them to light up the foreground objects. So if it's a tree, for example, I'll place it on the ground and then I'll take a photo, see how the exposure is to make sure that I don't see that it's actually lit up artificially, so I'll keep adjusting it until it looks natural. But you can use, like I said in my case, a solar powered spotlight to actually light up the foreground object against a star background, and it adds to the photo. Keeping in mind that it doesn't actually take much, you don't need a very strong light to do that, because with your camera set up at such a high ISO settings of ISO 1600 and even 3200, combined with your 20-second or 30-second shutter speed, you actually need very little light to light it up. So when there's no moon, I use the lighting, but when I found that when there's a half moon or full moon, that's enough to actually light up the whole area. It almost looks like day. So in those cases, I'm using the moon with time lapses just to try and capture the movement of shadow, for example. I'm actually focusing more so on the foreground, which is in this case would be trees, as opposed to the Milky Way. Because with the moon out, even half a moon, it just illuminates the sky so much. It's like city light pollution. It just washes away the nebula of the Milky Way, for example, and a lot of the dimmer stars, so you hardly get to see anything. Another little tip which is quite useful, because we turn off noise, we get noise reduction within the camera, you can actually create your own dark frames manually. And to do that, once you've set up your exposure settings, you've set up your ISO and shutter speed and you're happy with it, then you put the lens cap back on the lens, and then as an extra precaution I'll put a towel or something over the actual lens itself to block any light coming into the image sensor, so that I can then start taking photos with the same exposure settings and thus creating my own dark frames. Double check your focus, because obviously by putting the lens cap on and the towel you might inadvertently shift the focus of it, so just double check your focus. But basically, by doing the lens cap method, you've created your dark frame, so capture at least 3 frames. Either do it at the beginning of the sequence, which is probably more ideal if you do it before you start capturing. Sometimes I've gotten away with doing it in the next morning afterwards. But preferably you do it at the beginning of your capture session. Take your at least three dark frames, and then later on in post-editing, in Photoshop for example, you can create a batch process where you use those dark frames to subtract from every single frame in your sequence, and then that'll clean up your image even more. Okay, so in summary, I use a dew heater to actually keep the lens warm, so that the glass of the lens is warmer than the ambient temperature, so no dew or condensation will form. Then with my camera settings, I make sure that I have the camera in manual mode, and I have focus, aperture, white balance, ISO and shutter speed set manually, and I have auto ISO sensitivity switched off. And again, the reason for that is because I don't want the camera to have any kind of control over exposure, because if it does, that introduces variances from frame to frame as the camera compensates for different lighting conditions. And when you compile the frames together and play it back as a video, it creates annoying flicker, which you can get away with or fix up in post-editing, but that can be very time consuming, particularly if you've got about 600 frames.